I used to live in a condo in the center of a big city. I didn't own the place I was renting, and this building was mainly occupied by Airbnb rentals, which meant a constant flow of different people coming and going, especially on weekends. So, these were particularly noisy. The hallways and the common areas were filled with vacationers from all over, so there was a lot more partying in that building than anywhere else I had lived before or since. At the time, I was working 9 to 5, so I was usually in bed by 11 or midnight at the latest. But it was not uncommon to be woken up or kept awake by screams and noises of all kinds. I learned to live with it. It wasn't ideal, but moving was an even bigger hassle, so I found it better to stay where I was. With this as a context, the terrifying experience that I'm going to tell you about today happened 5 years ago. It was a Thursday night and I had a very busy day at work. I was working at the time in an office near my condo, and when I returned in the evening, I was looking forward to a quiet night's rest. So I made myself some dinner, watched some TV, and then sat on the couch reading a book. It was around 11 p.m. when all the rumbling started. At first, it was just booming voices echoing throughout the hallway, which was quite unusual. But I tried to ignore it and concentrate on my book. However, these voices got louder and louder, and I realized that there must have been at least 4 people involved in that argument, as they were all shouting at each other. A big fight was breaking out at that moment, which was quite hard to ignore, so I couldn't help but have my full attention on the conflict. The argument was going on, and it was getting louder and louder. Then I heard a loud bang. It could have been someone being pushed very hard against the wall, or so it sounded, but things escalated from there. This wasn't the first time a fight had occurred between tenants in the building, but it usually dissipated quickly, so it was almost never necessary to call security. Anyway, there were security cameras throughout the building, so the security guys were aware whenever something happened. However, in this case, things escalated so quickly, the security guys probably hadn't noticed yet, or maybe they were just on their way. Things seemed to be getting very ugly in the hallway, and by the time I decided to do something, it was a complete mess. It was a street fight, but in the middle of the hallway of the building. Those involved escalated to a level of violence too high. There were blows, screams, insults, broken things, and of course people hurting each other very brutally. Seeing that things were at that level, I thought about calling security myself. But before I could pull out my cell phone, a thunderous sound pierced through the noise. It was the unmistakable bang of a gunshot. The sound echoed throughout the hallway, and a thick silence followed. At that moment, I felt a shiver run down my spine, and my heart raced in panic. I had never in my life been in a situation of actual violence, and I had no idea if anyone had actually been hurt. I assumed they had. Somewhat paranoid, I began to check my body to make sure it wasn't me who had been hit in the shot. My hands were shaking, and I really don't remember feeling so scared in a long time. It all happened too fast, and then I heard a person running down the hallway, shuffling across the old carpet covering the floor, followed by the sound of a door slamming. At that moment, I pulled out my cell phone, but no longer to call. The security guys, but directly to 911. The operator answered, and I quickly explained what happened. I was told to stay in my apartment, lock the door, and wait for the police to arrive. Obviously, I did as I was told, so after locking everything, I simply went to my room and stood there, pacing back and forth expectantly. Within minutes, I heard sirens approaching, but I didn't know if they were heading towards the building, as there were sirens going off around there most of the time anyway, but I hoped these were for us. After a few moments later, I heard the cops outside in the hallway, talking and moving around, knocking on all the doors on my floor until they finally got to mine. I let them in, obviously, and they asked me some questions. I told them everything I knew. I heard the argument, the loud bang, the shouting and banging on the walls, and then the sound of gunfire followed by the sound of someone running down the hallway. I didn't know which door the person came through, but it was one of the apartments close to mine because it was very clear. The officers listened to my statement carefully and took down what I said. Then they told me to stay inside my apartment and let me know that they had to check the rest of the building again. I did exactly as I was told, locked the door, and after they left, I went to my living room. Still very shocked, I tried to distract myself by watching TV, but I really couldn't concentrate on anything. I kept thinking about the shooter and how close it was to my apartment. It was really scary to think that something like that could happen right next to where I lived. The rest of that night was pretty tense. I stayed up late listening to the sounds in the building. I heard the police talking to other people and pacing back and forth. After a while, things started to calm down a bit. However, in the morning, I found out more. About what happened, it turns out that indeed someone was shot, but fortunately the victim of the shooting survived and was recovering, while the person responsible was finally caught and placed under arrest. But that wasn't all I found out. I also learned that this was a dispute between two Airbnb hosts, which tragically escalated because one of them was the ex of the other's wife. And due to a twist of fate, they reportedly coincided in the same Airbnb. This was why tempers flared so quickly, as the husband thought the ex's presence in that building had been planned. In the days that followed, the police returned several times, asking more questions, trying to piece together the events of the night. The shooting changed the atmosphere in this quiet building. However, once the news of what happened arrived, the rental scene in the building changed dramatically, as no one wanted to stay there anymore. The building management beefed up security, but that wasn't enough for me. I moved out the following month. I had to cancel my lease because I really didn't feel safe there anymore.
Trying to save money on our way to go visit family, my wife and I decided to book a cheap Airbnb instead of a hotel. For a one-night stay, we were stopping on the long, dusty road when a remote property came into view. In that instant, my optimistic mood on the long road trip began to fade. The place looked shabby and isolated. It looked absolutely nothing like the queen-sized country cottage that was listed. My wife shot me a skeptical glance as I parked the car. In between taking a closer look at the facility, the faded wood siding was in dire need of a fresh coat of paint, and the overgrown landscape gave off a truly depressing sense of abandonment. I started to unload our travel bags, trying not to make too much of the situation, partly so as not to make my wife feel worse, but to little avail because she was very upset we had chosen a risky option for our brief stay. Certainly, the place was quite cheap, but the state it was in was absolutely different from what we had been offered. This was basically a dilapidated property almost in the middle of nowhere and looked more like an old wooden warehouse than a cabin. But I tried to appease things by reminding her that it would only be one night and tomorrow we would get up very early to continue on. Our way, a handwritten note greeted us at the worn front door, instructing us to use a code from the lockbox to access the keys. I entered the code with some difficulty due to the faded numbers, and listened as the old lock opened. A musty wood smell floated out as I opened the door. I turned on the dim ceiling lights, and this revealed the dusty furniture that looked as if it had not been touched for many years. On the walls were several animal heads hung as decorations, and also some huge moose antlers, which also added a rather sinister touch to the already horrifying place. My wife wrinkled her nose, but I gestured broadly around the main living room and said that at least we had the place to ourselves. I wish I felt as indifferent as I was pretending to be, but there was something about the stale, lifeless house that gave me the creeps. I shook those thoughts off, however, as I went to inspect the bedrooms. The largest one had mildew-filled floral wallpaper, but at least the wooden bed seemed to be in good condition, and the sheets were clean, something that surprised us a lot, considering everything I've mentioned to you so far. We deposited our bags on the double bed in order to stay there. For as little time as possible, I suggested we go into town for dinner. As we walked out the front door, The warped wooden floorboards squeaked under my feet. I made a joke about the ghosts landing with a thud in the musty silence, but my wife wasn't too amused, as nothing that night was. Throughout dinner, I kept catching my wife looking at me in exasperation whenever she thought I wasn't paying attention. I tried suggesting various activities for the next day, but she responded with evasive grunts, pushing the undercooked food around her plate. My attempts at upbeat conversation were met with stony silence during the drive. As I drove back to the musty cabin and hauled our travel bags inside, I turned on the porch light and walked in next to my wife, who was still grim-faced as I lay uncomfortably. Tossing and turning on the lumpy double bed, I had a series of nightmares. I imagined a tall, bearded man screaming as he was stabbed again and again, while a blonde woman sobbed in the background before her throat was slit. It was a scene graphically violent, but above all, vivid. I woke up drenched in sweat and with my heart pounding wildly. As I gasped for air, I looked to my side of the bed and saw that my wife was still sound asleep. I thought it was great that at least one of us had been able to fall asleep. I looked at the wall and saw the old floral wallpaper glowing faintly in the moonlight. This helped me gradually slow my frantic breathing, but the distorted images of the nightmare I had a moment ago remained etched in my mind and played over and over again. I rubbed my eyes and reached for my phone to find out what time it was, and the strong glow of the screen showed that it was only 2 a.m. I wondered what could have caused me to have such a viscerally disturbing dream. I wanted to get up to get some water, but before that, I looked around the room and then my breath caught in my throat. The walls were at completely different angles than they were when we went to bed. I noticed the diagonal in the small space, and the headboard was pushed into the corner. I blinked slowly several times, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me, but I wasn't wrong. The bed was definitely in the center of the room when we arrived. I climbed out from under the covers, and the wooden floor was rough under my feet. As I pulled the corner post of the stubborn bed frame, my tired eyes searched the room for any sign of an intruder, but there was no clear explanation for the movement of the furniture. Adrenaline flooded my system. I rushed through a thorough search of the entire house. I crawled from room to room, turning on the old yellowed bulbs in the ceiling. I did my best not to make any noise as I didn't want to wake my wife. She was stressed enough with this house without me telling her on top of it that the bed had moved on its own. The space was intact. I walked outside and everything seemed perfectly normal. Everything was completely silent, except for the movement of a skeleton brush rattling in the breeze. I checked the entire property and rechecked every closet, under the beds, behind the furniture. Nothing seemed disturbed or out of place beyond our bedroom. I stood guard all night by the living room window, looking out over the barren landscape of the area. The lonely road we arrived on was shrouded in darkness except for our car parked in front of a huge ghostly white cattle skull, its eye sockets empty and almost spectral. Exhaustion gradually softened my attention, and before I knew it, I was asleep, sitting up tense as a statue on the creaky wooden couch in the living room. Gradually, the light of dawn crept in through the window, and I awoke with a stiff neck when my wife came out fully rested. She raised an eyebrow to find me asleep upright, still watching as much as possible. I suggested we have an early breakfast before heading back on the road, but she said she wanted to get out of there as soon as possible, and honestly, so did I. She went into the bedroom to get the stuff to start loading it into the car, and that's when she asked me, "Hey, why did you move the bed out of position and at what time?" Because I didn't even feel it. I lied to her with an excuse about the breeze from the window, but she wasn't convinced. However, before she asked me another question I couldn't answer, I told her to hurry up and take advantage of the early drive. So we started loading the stuff into the car, and as soon as it was all there, I got out of there without looking back. I was still very overwhelmed by what happened in the night, but I tried to rationally reassure myself as we left, saying that cottages often change and settle over time. But it still made my skin crawl to think about what intentionally moved that bed in the night. As the rental car crossed the long gravel road away from the house, I could see in the windshield the reflection of my white knuckles. I looked in the rearview mirror as well, and I could see the door open, revealing the interior dark and endless, like a large Ganta waiting to swallow whole anyone naive enough to stay there after.